Evelyn woke up in her dark and messy room, surrounded by photos of a vibrant past that were now covered in dust. The air was heavy, and the sunlight could barely penetrate the dusty curtains. She stretched slowly, her bones creaking as if they were also tired of the oppressive routine that surrounded her. Hearing her daughter Rachel's voice shouting from downstairs, Evelyn felt a pang in her heart. "You can't just leave this until tomorrow, Mom. The bills are piling up." Rachel's voice echoed through the house, sharp and unrelenting. Evelyn sighed, remembering happier times when her life had color and meaning. She got up, dressed in the most comfortable clothes she had, and looked at the photographs that adorned the walls. Each one told a story, a moment frozen in time, but now they were mere memories that felt so distant. The image of her youth, dancing at joyful parties, stood in stark contrast to the loneliness she felt at that moment. Rachel burst into the room without knocking, an impatient expression on her face. "What are you doing just standing there? I have a list of things you need to do today. The house isn't going to clean itself." She held a sheet of paper in her hands, as if it were a royal decree. "Rachel, Evelyn started, but was interrupted by a look of disdain. "Don't waste my time, please. I'm not asking. I'm telling. And I don't want to hear your complaints," Rachel said, her voice loud and authoritative. Evelyn felt small, as if her words and feelings had no value. She simply nodded, a gesture that confirmed her submission. Her daughter left the room, and the old woman stood there, looking out the window. The world outside seemed so vibrant and full of life. Neighbors were out with smiles on their faces, children playing in the street, while Evelyn felt more and more like a prisoner in her own home. "Why did I let it get to this point?" she thought, remembering her adventurous spirit and her will to live. The house, which had once been a home full of laughter and love, now felt like a labyrinth of loneliness and despair. The walls were soaked in a sadness that accumulated day by day, slowly suffocating her. A deafening silence took over the environment until the sound of Rachel's shouting echoed again. "Evelyn, did you hear me? I don't want to have to repeat everything." Evelyn turned quickly, feeling the pressure rise. "Yes, dear. I'm coming," she replied, her voice trembling. She headed to the kitchen, where a pile of dirty dishes awaited her, a task that seemed endless. As she washed the dishes, her mind wandered to the days when she cooked for the family, when everyone gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter. "You need to stop daydreaming, Mom. What you need to do is focus on what really matters," Rachel interrupted, walking into the kitchen and watching Evelyn's every move with a critical eye. "I was just thinking about how we used to gather for dinner. How nice it was," Evelyn said, trying to bring a little light to the conversation. "That's the past. What matters is the present. And in the present, you need to help. So, get to work," Rachel replied, without a hint of sensitivity. The old woman fell silent, her heart heavy. She wanted to scream, wanted Rachel to understand how much she was hurting her. But the strength she once had faded day by day, and the fear of displeasing her daughter kept her silent. Evelyn finished the day's tasks, each movement becoming a ritual of submission. Looking out the window again, she saw neighbors gathering for a barbecue. The smell of grilled meat and laughter filled the air, and a deep desire to be part of that world overwhelmed her. But instead, she was trapped, imprisoned in a cycle of emotional abuse that seemed never-ending. The memories of a life filled with love and joy now blended with the despair of her current reality. Evelyn felt tears welling in her eyes, but she suppressed them. That wasn't what Rachel wanted to see. She just wished for a moment of dignity, a space where her voice could be heard. But as long as Rachel continued to dominate her life, that felt like a distant dream. George arrived in town with a sparkle in his eyes and a smile on his face, eager to reunite with his sister Evelyn after so many years. However, as he approached the house where she lived, he felt a heavy tension in the air. Rachel, his niece, was outside, furiously arguing on the phone. The tone of her voice, loaded with frustration and anger, made George hesitate for a moment. He knew it wasn't just an ordinary conversation. There was something deeper, a turbulence that seemed rooted in the very essence of that house. When Rachel noticed his presence, she set the phone aside and approached, though the greeting was cold and distant. "You finally came back," she remarked, in a tone that sounded more like an accusation than a greeting. "Evelyn is inside. I hope you don't come to disrupt things more than they already are." George simply nodded, feeling that the welcome was not what he had imagined. As he opened the door and stepped into the house, he was immediately enveloped by a familiar yet oppressive smell. The darkness and disorder of the environment seemed to reflect his sister's emotional state. He found Evelyn sitting in a worn armchair, her eyes shining with a mix of joy and sadness upon seeing him. "Evelyn," George exclaimed, rushing to hug her. "It's been so long, my dear sister." Evelyn smiled, her expression blending happiness and surprise. "Oh, George, I thought you'd never come back," she said, holding his hands tightly. "The house isn't the same without you." But as they talked, George couldn't help but notice the changes in Evelyn. She seemed more fragile, her face marked by lines of worry and sadness. "How are you, really?" he asked, a little hesitantly. "I'm surviving," Evelyn replied, with a sad smile. "Rachel has been difficult. She doesn't treat me the way I'd like, but I've gotten used to it." George frowned, concern growing inside him. "Difficult how?" he asked, trying to understand the depth of the situation. "She makes me do everything. The house chores, the shopping, everything. And when I try to speak, she just ignores me," Evelyn explained, her voice trembling. "Sometimes, I feel like I'm nothing more than a maid here." George's heart ached upon hearing this. He had always known Rachel had a strong temper, but he never imagined she could treat Evelyn so cruelly. "You don't deserve this, Evelyn," he said firmly. "You've always been an amazing mother and deserve love and respect." Evelyn looked away, as if the pain was too intense to face. "I know, but it's hard. Rachel has her own problems, and I don't want to be a burden," she murmured, her voice low. George decided he needed to understand the situation better. After the visit, he started talking to neighbors and friends, trying to gather information about the family dynamics. He discovered that Rachel had always been controlling, and many remembered how demanding she was even in childhood. Some old acquaintances of Evelyn shared stories of her generosity and kindness, contrasting with the image of the woman who now seemed so oppressed. "She used to help all of us," a neighbor recalled, with a nostalgic look. "And now, it's sad to see her like this, so lost." George was determined to help Evelyn. He knew he needed to be her voice, the protection she couldn't find on her own. What started as a casual visit turned into a mission, to uncover the truth about what was really happening inside that house and find a way to free his sister from the cycle of oppression that held her hostage. George, sensing the tension in the air, decided he needed to better understand the situation between his sister Evelyn and her daughter, Rachel. On his first visit to the neighborhood where he grew up, he met a neighbor, Mrs. Clara, who had known the family for years. They sat in the shade of a leafy tree, and George, in a cautious tone, asked, "Mrs. Clara, have you noticed how Evelyn is? I've always known her to be a lively woman." Mrs. Clara sighed, her gaze distant. "Oh, my dear, Evelyn has always been a generous soul. But over time, Rachel became increasingly controlling. She never managed to cope well with the pressures of life. When her marriage started to fall apart, she began to unload all her frustration onto her mother." George furrowed his brow. "Are you saying their relationship was never healthy?" "Exactly. Rachel has always been a complicated girl, and Evelyn, always so dedicated, ended up giving in to all her whims. But that didn't help her. On the contrary, it made her even more difficult. Their relationship is like a house of cards, about to collapse at any moment." Intrigued, George decided to seek more information. He remembered a childhood friend, Laura, who had always admired Evelyn's kindness. With a surge of hope, he went to her house. When he arrived, Laura greeted him with a warm smile, but her expression quickly faded upon noticing George's seriousness. "Laura, how have you seen Evelyn lately?" he asked, a tone of concern in his voice. Laura sighed, her eyes glistening. "Unfortunately, Evelyn is not the same anymore. She was so full of life, always helping others. I remember how she used to organize events to raise funds for the community school. She was a force of nature." "And now?" George pressed, anxious for details. "Now, she's trapped in that house. Rachel treats her like a servant, not like a mother. I've seen Evelyn crying a few times when she thought no one was watching. It's sad, George. Something needs to be done." With each new piece of information, George felt his heart tighten. He decided he needed to document everything that was happening. He returned home and, at an improvised table in his room, began taking notes. Rachel is controlling. Evelyn is vulnerable. The family dynamic is unbalanced, he wrote, as his thoughts swirled. George was not content just to record the situation. He needed to act. He knew that to help his sister, he had to expose the truth. With that in mind, he decided he would confront Rachel. But first, he wanted to make sure that when he spoke, he would have information that could make Rachel reflect on her actions. As he wrote, a sweet memory washed over him. The summers of childhood when he and Evelyn played in the backyard. He recalled the way she laughed, the sparkle in her eyes. Now, those same eyes were clouded by pain and sadness. George took a deep breath. The fight for justice and dignity was just beginning, and he was determined to be the voice that Evelyn needed. At that moment, George decided that not only did he need to understand the truth, but he also had to ensure that Evelyn was no longer alone in this struggle. He felt motivated to be the strength that could help her break free from the oppression that suffocated her. The journey for his sister's dignity was about to intensify, and he was not willing to give up. George sat at the kitchen table, watching the tense dynamic between the women in his family. The atmosphere was heavy, as if an invisible fog hung over them. Evelyn, with trembling hands, tried to serve the coffee, but Rachel interrupted her with her cutting voice. "You're not going to put too much sugar, are you? I don't want you to ruin the coffee again," Rachel said, with a look of disdain. Evelyn swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her daughter's gaze. She was no longer the vibrant woman she once was. Her confidence had been eroded by years of disdain and manipulation. After Rachel left to tend to her chores, George approached Evelyn, trying to break through the barrier of sadness that surrounded her. "You know you don't have to do everything she says, right?" He spoke gently, remembering the strength and joy his sister had shown in the past. Evelyn looked at him, a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. I don't know how to assert myself, George. She's always been like this. Since we were little, I let her take control of everything. But you deserve to be heard, Evelyn, and I'm here to help. How about we record some of the interactions with her? It could be a way for you to protect yourself and, who knows, empower yourself, George suggested, a spark of determination in his eyes. Evelyn hesitated. The idea was terrifying, but at the same time, the prospect of having a tool that could give her a voice seemed appealing. She took a deep breath and replied, "Do you really think that would work?" "Yes, I believe it will. Let's start slow. We can do this together, and I will be by your side the whole time," George encouraged her, smiling kindly. In the days that followed, George and Evelyn began documenting their conversations. The recordings brought a new kind of hope. In the moments they weren't recording, they shared laughter and memories of happier times. The connection between them strengthened, and Evelyn began to remember the woman she once was, full of life and dreams. One morning, while reviewing a recording, Evelyn let out a genuine laugh as she recalled a story about her first meeting with George in a local park. "Do you remember how you taught me to ride a bike? I fell so many times, but you never gave up on me," she said, her eyes shining. "Of course I remember. And you always got back up and tried again." "That's the Evelyn I know," George replied, gently touching her hand. "That woman is still inside you, waiting to be set free." Meanwhile, Rachel began to notice the changes in the family dynamic. The tension grew as she felt threatened by the new closeness between George and Evelyn. One day, upon entering the kitchen, Rachel noticed the recorder on the table. Her gaze narrowed, and she turned to Evelyn. "What are you doing? Are you recording our conversations? This is unacceptable." Evelyn felt her heart race. "Rachel, it's not what you think. We're just trying to understand better." She began to explain, but Rachel cut her off. "Understand? You're playing the victim again. This is just a form of manipulation, Mom. Do you really think people are going to believe you?" Rachel's anger was palpable, and Evelyn felt small and powerless. George, noticing the situation, intervened. "Rachel, this is an important step for Evelyn. She needs space to express herself, and you can't keep controlling her like this." Rachel shot a disdainful look at George, but he stood firm. "You need to understand that this dynamic cannot continue. What you're doing to her is abusive, and we can no longer allow it." The tension in the kitchen was unbearable. Rachel, realizing she had lost control of the situation, turned and left, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Evelyn, still trembling, looked at George. "I don't know if I can do this. What if she gets even more aggressive?" "I'll be here the whole time, Evelyn. We'll face this together. What you need now is to find your voice." "You're stronger than you think," George assured her, squeezing her hand. That night, as they prepared for more recordings, Evelyn felt a spark of courage. The road would be challenging, but she was willing to fight for herself and, who knows, maybe one day reclaim not just her dignity, but also her place in the family. Evelyn sat in her old armchair, watching the sunlight stream through the window of her room, illuminating the walls that were covered with photos. The images showed a life filled with joy, moments of happiness and shared laughter. However, looking at those dusty pictures, reality enveloped her like a heavy cloak. She felt invisible, as if her essence had been erased along with the color of the walls and the brightness of the memories. Her gaze drifted into the memories of a time when she danced by the lake with George, her brother, under the sunset. A flashback took over her mind. It was a sunny day, and Evelyn was in a park, laughing as George taught her to ride a bike. "You can do it, Evelyn. Just keep your eyes straight and pedal," he encouraged, his wide smile reflecting the innocence of childhood. She remembered the feeling of freedom, the wind in her face, and the pure joy she felt with each pedal. "I can do it. I'm going," she shouted, while George supported her, holding the bike until she finally let go and started pedaling on her own. The scene quickly shifted, taking her to another memory. Rachel's birthday party when her daughter was still a lively child. Evelyn was dancing, the music echoing in her ears. She remembered how smiles and laughter filled the air, making her feel alive. "Look at Mommy. She's the best dancer," Rachel had shouted, and Evelyn couldn't help but laugh and twirl, her skirts swirling around her. It was a time when life was a celebration, not a burden. In the present, Evelyn found herself trapped in her home, under the controlling and demanding gaze of Rachel. The tension between mother and daughter was palpable, and Rachel's bitterness manifested in every word she spoke. "Haven't you finished cleaning the kitchen yet? I can't believe I had to ask you to do this again." Rachel frequently attacked her with cutting criticisms, as if Evelyn were a maid and not her mother. George, who had returned to town, began to notice the transformation in Evelyn. When visiting her, he felt his heart tighten at the fragility in her expression. "Evelyn, do you remember those afternoons when we danced in the living room?" he asked, trying to bring back a bit of the joyful spirit that still existed within her. "Of course, George. I used to dance like no one was watching," she replied, a shy smile blooming on her face, but it quickly faded as she recalled the harshness of the present days. As George reviewed the recordings he had made of the interactions between Rachel and Evelyn, he felt deeply moved. The images showed Evelyn, a woman who once radiated joy, now reduced to a shadow of her former self. He saw the transformation in her face, the sadness in her eyes reflecting the weight of helplessness. How could you have come to this, Evelyn? He whispered to himself, the pain in his heart intensifying. He couldn't believe that the woman who once danced and laughed now felt so lost. You deserve to be happy, Mom, he murmured, determined to help his sister reclaim her dignity. Life shouldn't be this way. You shouldn't live in fear. These memories became a catalyst for George, who decided to fight for Evelyn. He remembered every laugh, every moment of happiness, and he couldn't let those moments slip away without a fight. Evelyn, beside him, seemed to begin to awaken. Laughter and smiles started to return, even if for small moments. And as they shared those memories, a small spark of hope began to glow in their hearts. George knew it was time to confront Rachel. He could no longer stay silent while his sister emotionally exploited Evelyn, leaving their mother in a state of vulnerability he never imagined witnessing. The atmosphere in the house had been tense since George's arrival, and he could feel the coldness in Rachel's gaze. It was as if she were constantly on guard, ready to attack at any moment. That morning, as the sun's rays filtered through the curtains, George decided he could wait no longer. He found Rachel in the kitchen, preparing a hurried breakfast, her hands trembling slightly as she whisked the eggs. He took a deep breath, gathering courage for what was to come. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said, his voice firm but calm. She turned quickly, irritation etched on her face. "About what?" "I don't have time for your philosophical conversations, George. I have a job to do." "About Mom," George insisted, not backing down. "About how you treat her." Rachel let out a bitter laugh, her eyes narrowing. "What do you know about how I treat Mom? You've barely been here. You came to meddle in my life like you know everything." "I know enough to see that you're making her a servant instead of a mother," he replied, the tension rising. "She is not your maid, Rachel. She deserves respect and dignity." "Respect?" Rachel almost shouted. "Respect is what I don't get. You have no idea what it's like to take care of her every day, dealing with her laments and memories. I'm stuck here, George, and you just show up out of nowhere to tell me how I should act?" George felt her anger, but he couldn't let it intimidate him. "You're not stuck, Rachel. You chose this life. And if you keep going like this, you're going to end up losing Mom for real. Not the vibrant woman she used to be, but the one you're suffocating." Rachel paused, her eyes narrowing as she realized George was determined. "And what do you suggest? That I just let her go? She can't take care of herself? She needs support, not control. You can help her find herself again, regain her voice. But that's only going to happen if you change your approach." She hesitated, and for a moment, George saw a weakness in her gaze. "What if I don't know how to do that? What if I fail?" "You don't have to do it alone. We can do this together," he offered, trying to find a path that wasn't just confrontation. "But first, you need to acknowledge what you're doing. You're treating her like a burden instead of a mother." Rachel shook her head, clearly struggling against her emotions. "You don't understand what I've been through. You don't know the weight I carry. My problems aren't just about Mom. I have my own life, my own demons. I know you're struggling, but that doesn't justify how you treat Mom," George insisted, his tone firm but compassionate. "It's time for you to look within and confront your pain, instead of dumping it on your mother. You can break this cycle." Rachel's eyes shone with anger and sadness, and she turned to the sink, trying to hide the weakness that overtook her. "You have no idea what it's like to live like this, George. You've always been the favorite, always had the best opportunities. Meanwhile, I'm here, trying to hold everything together. That's not fair, Rachel. I'm not your enemy. I just want you to see what's happening. Mom isn't the only one suffering. You are too, but that pain can't be the reason to hurt others," he replied, his voice softer now. Rachel turned, her eyes filled with tears. "And what if I don't know how to change? What if I can't?" George, sensing her vulnerability, stepped forward. "Then let's find help. Let's look for therapy, something that can help us understand what's going on. It doesn't have to be this way." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken emotion. George knew there was an internal battle within Rachel, and he hoped that by confronting her, he could open a door to healing. The tension was still there, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a sign that maybe change was possible. The sun slowly set, painting the sky orange and purple, as Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her trembling hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. The atmosphere was charged with tension, an invisible cloud that seemed to expand with every moment. George, who was beside her, watched their mother with a mix of concern and hope. He felt that something was about to change, but he didn't know whether it would be for better or worse. "Are you feeling okay, Mom?" he asked, breaking the silence that hung between them. Evelyn looked up, a spark of determination beginning to show in her eyes. "Today, I feel like I need to do something," she replied, her voice a bit firmer than usual. George smiled, encouraging her to continue. "Like what? What do you have in mind?" he prodded, knowing that the change needed to come from Evelyn, but also wishing for her to feel supported. "I can't just sit here obeying her orders anymore. Rachel, she can't treat me like this forever," Evelyn declared, indignation starting to take over her being. George felt his heart race. It was a sign that his mother was beginning to break free from the emotional shackles that bound her. "That's right, Mom. You have every right to assert yourself, and I'll be here to support you," George encouraged her, his voice full of conviction. Evelyn nodded, a slight smile appearing on her lips, but the shadow of fear still lingered over her. However, the momentary peace was quickly interrupted by Rachel's entrance. She walked into the kitchen with a closed expression, her eyes cold as steel. "What are you two whispering about? Another plan to sabotage me?" she shot, crossing her arms at her chest, a defensive posture that made clear her alert state. "Nothing like that, Rachel. We were just talking," George replied, trying to keep calm. But the tension in the air was palpable. Evelyn felt her stomach churn but struggled to maintain her composure. "You need to stop interfering in your mother's life, George. She needs discipline, not a partner in crime," Rachel said, her voice sharp. Evelyn felt a chill in her stomach at her daughter's words, but the determination within her began to grow. "Disciplining is not the same as controlling, Rachel. You know very well that the way you treat her is not healthy," George declared, his tone now more firm. The tension escalated and Rachel's eyes narrowed, overflowing with anger. "I'm not here to discuss this with you. I'm the only one who takes care of her. You can't just show up and change everything," Rachel said, her voice raised, almost shouting. The atmosphere became tense, as if a thread about to snap hung between the three of them. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling adrenaline rush through her veins. "Rachel, I'm not a child. I can make my own decisions," she said, her voice stronger than ever. George looked at his mother in surprise, admiring her courage. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, disbelief taking over her face. "You're asserting yourself now? After all these years where I did everything for you?" she shot back, but Evelyn's determination did not waver. "Yes, after all these years. I can't live like this anymore, Rachel. You make me feel like a stranger in my own home," Evelyn replied, her gaze steady. George felt a warmth in his chest, seeing his mother rise against the oppression that suffocated her. Rachel, overwhelmed by anger and confusion, began to scream, but George intervened. "Rachel, enough. You need to hear what your mother is saying. This behavior is not normal. You are suffocating your own mother," he exclaimed, his voice echoing in the kitchen. "You don't know anything about my life. You've been gone, George. You can't just come back and judge," Rachel retorted. But the words sounded emptier as the truth began to reveal itself. Evelyn took a deep breath, realizing this was the turning point. "Rachel, I love you, but I can't live by your rules anymore. I'm feeling suffocated and invisible," she said, each word heavy as a stone, yet at the same time liberating. George watched the scene with hope, noticing a slight change in Rachel's expression. It was a mix of confusion and fear. He knew the battle was far from won, but he felt that something had shifted. The dynamic was beginning to transform, and Evelyn's courage could be the first step toward a new life, full of dignity and love. George and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the air, mingled with the tension that hung over them. George looked at his mother, his heart tightening as he noticed the fragility surrounding her. "Mom," he began, his voice gentle, "I think it's time we talk to the family. We can't let Rachel continue like this." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes drifting to the coffee mug she held. She remembered better times when the kitchen table was filled with laughter and stories, not silences and discouragement. "George, I don't know if I'm ready for this. What if it makes everything worse?" Her voice trembled, reflecting not only fear, but also a cautious hope. "We need to do this, not just for you, but for her too. Rachel needs to understand that what she is doing is not right. And maybe, if she realizes that, it will help her change," George replied, determined. He knew that confrontation was necessary, but he also feared the consequences. "And if she doesn't listen? What if she attacks us again?" Evelyn asked, her concern evident. She remembered all the times she had tried to stand up to Rachel, only to be silenced. The look of disdain from her daughter still echoed in her mind. George leaned forward, holding his mother's hand. "I'll be with you, Mom. We won't face this alone. We'll call the rest of the family, and together, we can make Rachel hear the truth." He spoke with conviction, but he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult and filled with turbulent emotions. With a deep sigh, Evelyn finally agreed. "All right, let's do this. But please, let me know when you're going to talk to them." Evelyn's decision was an important step, but her vulnerability was still at the surface. On the appointed day, the house was busier than usual. Family members began to arrive, and the buzz of voices and laughter made Evelyn's heart race. But the weight of the truth she carried made her feel like a stranger in her own home. Rachel arrived last, her imposing presence immediately creating a palpable tension in the air. George shot a meaningful glance at Evelyn, who responded with a nervous nod. It was time. "Hi, everyone. What's going on here?" Rachel asked, her voice dripping with disdain. She noticed the heavy atmosphere and immediately took a defensive stance. "Rachel, we need to talk," George said, his voice firm. He was ready to face the storm. "About you and how you've been treating Mom." Rachel raised an eyebrow, crossing her arms. "Oh, sure. Let's talk about the victim here. What do you want, George? For me to put her on a pedestal? She does nothing but sit around, complaining about life." Evelyn felt a knot in her stomach upon hearing her daughter's words. "Rachel, that's not what we're saying," she intervened, her voice hesitant but determined. "I just want a chance to be heard. I feel invisible to you." "Invisible? You're just an old woman who doesn't know what to do with her life," Rachel yelled, her frustration overflowing. "I have my own stress, my own life to take care of. And you, Mom, don't help me at all." "That's not true, Rachel. Don't you see how much your anger hurts me?" Evelyn said, her voice faltering slightly. The look from her daughter made her feel small, but she was determined to be heard. The other family members began to murmur among themselves, surprised by the intensity of the discussion. "Rachel, this isn't just about you," George insisted, trying not to let the situation spiral into chaos. "We need to face the truth. You've been controlling, and it's hurting our mom. You don't understand anything. You left my life, and now you come back to tell me how to act." Rachel was in a frenzy, but George stood firm. "I understand more than you think. And if you don't stop treating Mom this way, it's going to break all of us. What you're doing is emotional abuse, and I won't stay silent anymore," he asserted, the determination in his voice echoing in the heart of the room. Other family members began to speak up. "Rachel, we've noticed how you've been behaving towards Evelyn. You need to acknowledge this," an aunt commented, her gaze sad. "We're here to help, but we need you to cooperate too," another family member added, trying to calm the tempers. Rachel looked around, realizing she was not alone. The weight of George's words and the family's observations hit her. She was surrounded by concerned yet disappointed looks. Evelyn, with tears in her eyes, finally found the courage to speak. I just want to be loved and respected. And Rachel, I love you, but I can't live like this anymore. The sincerity of her words reverberated in the room, creating a profound silence. The truth was in the air, and now everyone could feel it. The tension remained, but an important step had been taken. The path to healing was still filled with uncertainties, but the first seed of change had been planted. The atmosphere in the room was charged with tension, as if the air was electrified, about to explode at any moment. George had gathered the family members in Rachel's small living room, a space that, while familiar, now felt like a battlefield. Evelyn, sitting in a worn-out chair, watched the scene with a mix of apprehension and hope. It was the first time in years that she felt part of something bigger, part of a struggle that was not just hers. Rachel, we need to talk about how you've been treating our mother, George began, his voice firm but with a slight tremor. He felt the weight of the words, as if each syllable had to cross a sea of pain and silence. She is not your servant, nor your property. She is a person and deserves respect. Rachel, with her face red with anger, crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. And who do you think you are, George? You walked away, and now you come back as if you know everything? You don't live here. You don't know what it's like to take care of her every day. I'm the only one who does. But at what cost, Rachel? George replied, frustration clear in his voice. You don't care for her. You control her. You make her feel insignificant. He turned to Evelyn, who was watching him with tears in her eyes. Mom, you need to speak. You're not alone. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling courage arise from a place that had long been dormant. Rachel, she began, her voice trembling but determined. I can't live like this anymore. I feel like I'm dying every day, suffocated by your disdain and your anger. I want to be seen. I want to be heard. Rachel, consumed by indignation, interrupted. Don't come blaming me for your weaknesses. You've always been weak, Evelyn, always dependent on others. And now, even your brother has to come here to defend you? Defend? No, Rachel. He's here to support me, to help me escape this prison you've created. Evelyn responded, her voice growing stronger. I'm not weak. I'm a woman who has lived and has stories to tell. You don't have the right to treat me like this. The other family members, who had been silent until now, began to stir, murmuring among themselves. The tension was palpable, and a cousin of George's, who had always been close to Evelyn, finally spoke up. Rachel, you know this isn't right. We all know how you've treated Aunt Evelyn. It's time for you to look at yourself and see what you're doing. Rachel shot a cutting glance, but George remained unfazed. You can't keep hiding behind a facade of control and manipulation. That's not love, and you know it. You're hurting our mother. Hurting? Rachel laughed, but there was no joy in her laughter. And what do you know about hurting? You haven't lived it. I'm the one who stays here, facing all of this alone. You don't know the pain of dealing with her every day, with her laments and weaknesses. Evelyn, now firmer, looked into her daughter's eyes. Rachel, I'm not your enemy. I'm your mother. I don't want you to suffer, but I can't be the target of your pain anymore. You need to stop using me as an emotional punching bag. I never wanted to hurt you. Rachel screamed, but the defense was crumbling. The desperation in her expression was clear, as if the truth she was trying to hide was about to be exposed. I just wanted you to be strong, that you wouldn't need anyone. I am strong, Rachel. Strength isn't being alone, but knowing when to ask for help. And I'm asking for help now. For you. Evelyn's tone was soft, but each word carried a deep emotional weight. I want you to acknowledge your pain, to seek help. This isn't just about me, it's about us. The room fell silent. Rachel, now with tear-filled eyes, looked at all the faces surrounding her. The reality of Evelyn's words began to seep into her consciousness. The struggle wasn't just Evelyn's, but that of all the lives her pain affected. In a moment of vulnerability, Rachel let out a deep sigh, and the uncontrolled look she had transformed into something softer, more lost. I don't know how to deal with this. With all of this. I'm so tired. George, noticing his sister's fragility, stepped a little closer. Then maybe it's time for you to stop fighting against everyone and start fighting for yourself. So we can heal this as a family. Evelyn watched, her heart racing, as Rachel's internal battle became visible. The confrontation had revealed not only her own wounds but also Rachel's. The room was filled with emotions, a storm of pain and hope. It was the beginning of something new, an uncertain path, but one that could lead to healing if only they were willing to continue the fight together. After the intense family confrontation, George stepped back a little, allowing the tension in the air to dissipate. He sat in a chair in the living room, observing the faces of his relatives, many of whom seemed shocked by the revelation of Rachel's true nature. Evelyn, on the other hand, felt that a new courage had emerged within her. She was tired of being silenced, of being a shadow in her own daughter's life. But as the adrenaline faded, a new unease began to form. Rachel, still standing with tear-filled eyes, looked like a lost child in a world that had crushed her. The desperation in her gaze was palpable, and George, sensing his sister's fragility, decided to give space for emotions to flow. He knew that what was happening was an opportunity, perhaps the last, to reverse years of pain and resentment. Rachel, George began, his voice gentle yet firm. You need to look within yourself. What do you really want? Because this fight isn't just about you and Evelyn. It's about us, as a family. Rachel, head down, bit her lip, struggling against tears. I don't know what to do, George, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I feel like I'm stuck in an endless cycle. Everything I do feels insufficient. I can't be the daughter you and she expect. Evelyn, hearing her daughter's words, felt a mix of pain and compassion. She had always known Rachel carried her own wounds, but she had never been able to see beyond the anger that her daughter directed at her. Rachel, she said, breaking the heavy silence. If you feel trapped, then let's find a way out together. I've lost myself over the years too, but it's not too late for us. Evelyn's words were a balm amid the emotional storm. Rachel lifted her eyes, and the two women locked gazes. Are you really willing to listen to me? Rachel asked, the vulnerability in her voice breaking down some of the barrier that had formed between them. I am, Evelyn replied, feeling her heart race. But we need to be honest with each other. We need to face our fears and the pain we carry. George watched, his heart tight but hopeful. He knew that for there to be healing, both needed to be willing to open up. Rachel, you know you can count on me. I also want to understand what happened to you. Why did you become this person who controls and manipulates? Rachel hesitated, an internal conflict evident on her face. I always wanted to be perfect. I always thought that if I were perfect, life would be easier. But the more I tried, the more alone I felt. And when you left, George, everything fell apart. I didn't know how to deal with it, so I just held on to everything I could control. And that includes you, Mom. Evelyn felt a wave of empathy. Rachel, no one expects you to be perfect. No one is. And I have always loved you, even when you were distant. I just wanted you to know that I was here, available for you. But you shut yourself off so tight. Rachel's eyes sparkled with tears. I didn't know how to ask for help. I was so busy trying to cope with my own suffering that I didn't realize you were suffering too. I only saw you as an extension of my problems. The silence that followed was heavy, but there was a new energy in the air. George, sensing it was the right moment, spoke up again. What if we sought help together? There's a therapist in town who can help us better understand our feelings and our history. What do you think? Rachel looked at George, then at Evelyn, and finally nodded slowly. I want to try. I want to change. But I can't do it alone. And you don't have to, Evelyn said, her voice firm but filled with love. I need to change too. We can do this together, but we need professional help. Love can heal, but healing becomes easier when we're not alone. Rachel nodded, and for the first time in a long time, a fragile smile appeared on her face. Thank you, Mom. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm willing to try. Evelyn stepped closer and, with a gentle gesture, touched her daughter's hand. We all make mistakes, dear. What matters is that we're here now together. Let's give ourselves a second chance. George smiled with relief, feeling the weight that had settled over the family begin to dissipate. The journey would be long and full of challenges, but they were ready to face whatever came their way, united by love and the hope for a new beginning.